Welcome to this book launch from Pippa, Rann Books and Media. I'm the publisher of Pippa, Rann Books and Media, and it's my great pleasure to have in the virtual studio with me today three outstanding personalities for the launch of this wonderful book, Anthropocene, Climate Change, Contagion, and Consolation. So the first person is Professor Malashri Lal, the doyen of Indian literary critics, academics, who's here to give her views, and I assume her blessings to the launch of this book. We have, of course, Sudeep himself, Sudeep Sen, the poet, a multi-award-winning poet from India, and whose book it is, of course. And we have the great pleasure of having as our guest of honor, Carolyn Forchè. Now, the interesting thing about Malashri Lal, Professor Malashri Lal, is that she is a gardener and has been using the lockdown to grow roses. So perhaps she has discovered some roses, figuratively speaking, also in Sudeep's poems. We'll find out. And of course, we have Sudeep himself, a poet, and he has been using his time very constructively in not playing golf and not playing badminton, which is what he would have done if he'd been allowed to. But perhaps he's been playing golf and badminton mentally, linguistically. And this book is perhaps the result of part of it. We'll find out when he speaks to us in a few minutes. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Forchè. And what you won't know about Carolyn by looking her up on the internet and so on, is that Carolyn used to be a figure skater. Not surprising, you may think, when you look at her, but you wouldn't know it otherwise. And she completed her PhD at the young age of 70. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that, perhaps, as we go on. Carolyn, over to you for the launch of the book, please.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure. I greet all of you, and I hope that you'll remain safe and healthy in the midst of these difficult times. I'm happy to know that Sigrid is here with us because of her presence. Derek is also here, Derek Walcott in spirit, a poet who meant so much to Sudeep and also to all of us. With Anthropocene, Sudeep Sen has written a report from the front line of an earth in peril, from India and Bangladesh, countries that have experienced already what the rest of the world will endure in the decades to come if we do not shift course dramatically. We read these individual poems as a 21st century epic, so rarely attempted and achieved in our time. But it is at once collective and personal, historical and immediate. I can think of only one other contemporary poet who mastered this form, and it was Sudeep's mentor, Derek Walcott, with his Omeros. In Sudeep Sen's Anthropocene, we feel viscerally the heat in Delhi, yoki, oppressive, like filigreed sand on the skin, as he writes. We see the skies, whether empty, beautiful, or threatening, in poems and also in photographs taken from his terrace during the year's sequestration. We hear the palpable silence of the room where Sudeep composed this work in the deep solitude imposed by the viral pandemic. This is an expansive, urgent appeal to humanity, and it is also a beautiful work of lyric and photographic art. I would like to share one of the poems with you. I'm going to read the poem Language, which begins with an epigraph by Italo Calvino. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another. The translation, seamless, oracles, ventricles pump blood, core like alphabets, phrases, syntax, cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence, spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms, dance, ligatures, pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language. And with this, I declare the launch of the magnificent Anthropocene by Sudeep Sen. Congratulations, Sudeep, and congratulations to the birth of this book.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That's a wonderful way of launching the book. Thank you for reading the poem as well. So over to Sudeep to respond to that, if I may invite him to do so.
Caroline, I don't know what to say. It's just so generous, and your comments was like another poem. It was such a typical Caroline poem. It just could stand as a poem. Forget about me, really, really. Thank you for the generosity, and the kindness, and the love, and the friendship over all these years. You know, these transcontinental bonds are very, very important in these times. So I'm glad the reading that's spontaneously. I do a lot of things spontaneously. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I'd like to dedicate it to all the people who are suffering and all to the frontline workers. Really, I think it's really for them. It is a plea. It is a plea. And yes, my mentor Derek Walcott's wife, Sigrid Nama, who's a friend of both Caroline and I, is present in the house. So thank you, Sigrid, for calling me and wanting to be here. It's really special. It's in India, we say something like the Guru Shishya Parampara, which is the master student lineage. And that's how I feel about Derek, really, and so on. So thank you very, very much. I will read a poem, perhaps, to kick off the evening. And Caroline, thank you so much for reading language. You know, that's such a lovely thing to do. And talking about roses, you know, one of my lesser known hidden things, which I couldn't think of letting, was I'm obsessed with tea and tea leaves. I drink a lot of tea, mostly Earl Grey, but I also mix herb and tea. So black Darjeeling and sun-dried rose petal. So there's already a connection, I see. This is called Disembodied. And obviously, I don't want to say too much except that it's based in Delhi, but it could be anywhere. And it talks about the situation we are in right now. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned brick of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. A universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing, and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize it's you. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessing, but it contours, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left or too much water that is undrinkable. Sorry. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no Polestar navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away. Just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there's too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Sudeep, for reading that for us. And I'm so glad we could see the text as well as it was being read, because then you can follow it so much better. May I invite Malashri, please, to offer any comments she wishes to on the poem, or indeed on the book, or indeed on Sudeep's poetry in general, just as you wish. And then I'll come on to you, Caroline, again, if I may, to comment on the poem. So Mala first, please.
Thank you, Prabhu. It's really wonderful to be here, and glad to meet Caroline. And I've been an admirer of Sudeep's poetry for many, many years. We go back together as friends and also as scholars and critics of poetry. And indeed, this is an extraordinary book. And this particular poem, Disembodied, is dedicated to Amitav Ghosh. And speaking from where I do, which is Delhi, the noxious air that Sudeep's poem talks about, well, it's more than that right now. It's in the middle of a very, very difficult situation. And the poem speaks very personally to me, because so many of us in this city have losses that we are mourning, difficulties that we are facing. And when Sudeep talks about the disembodied condition of the city, the country, humanity as it is hit now, it really is a poem that touches us deeply. So thank you, Sudeep, for those extraordinary words. Experiences turned into remarkable poetry. And that is the transition that I do admire in your work, that it is everyday experience, the experience of community, friendship, love, mourning, sorrow, death, grief, but you put it together in beautiful, well-crafted poetry. So this particular poem, I wonder why you dedicated it to Amitav Ghosh. I suppose he's a natural reference when we are talking about climate change, but he wrote his work in prose. And of course, some of his fiction also looks at difficulties and challenges of climate change and environment preservation. But you have done this through poetry, which in many ways is far more difficult to do. And in my reading, it seems to be the first single-authored book of poetry. And you've also got some microfiction in it. But it's a single-authored book which is mainly in poetry, which is focusing on climate change and the pandemic. And then in one of the sections of the book as such, you have shown another kind of disembodiment and that coming together. For instance, there is a section with photographs. As Caroline mentioned, that you were on your terrace and every night at a particular time you would take photographs. So in a way, it's the body of the sky over this difficult city. And yet your discrete photographs are accompanied by poetry and a poetic kind of and it reminds us of the humanity that we need right now to overcome the challenges of the pandemic. So although the poem is called Disembodied, thank you.
No, indeed. No, I'm glad you reference all these different things. For me, poetry and literature is only one small parallel line amongst many parallel lines that exist. I've grown up, particularly in a certain kind of a Bengali family, with music, art, politics, poetry, food, friendship, laughter, a lot of noise. Amartya Sen writes a whole book called The Argumentative Indian. So in a sense, we are talking about embodiment of various kinds, and the world likes to disembody things and wants us to specialize. Of course, as a poet, I'm a specialist at creating poetry, but it's always linked to a larger arc of humanity, of sustenance, of spirituality, of words, of relationships. Because, you can have a beautiful crafted piece of art, but if it has no soul, what's the point? And if it's only soul and no craft, it's problematic too. So that's where, the greats like people ask me, who are your favorite poets? And this is such a problematic, banal question, but journalists tend to ask that. So I say, first is God, a secular God, because I don't believe in God necessarily, because I'm just as comfortable in a church or in a mosque or in a temple. So faith, perhaps. The silver medal goes to Milton. And imagine Milton. I mean, how can you not like that man? He takes 16 books to write one poem. I mean, he's not satisfied with just Paradise Lost in 12 books. He has to write 4 more to regain it. And the third one would be Derek Walcott, of course, for personal reasons. And Sigrid, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your presence and Derek's shadow and experience here. So yes, Walcott. So Walcott, for instance, just to bring in a parallel motive or an example, he was a playwright, he was a painter, he was a scholar, he was a thinker, and of course a poet. So, when all these things are stitched together in a holistic way, then you can sort of present yourself in a way that is more centered, and being centered and balanced is very, very important, I feel.
So, Caroline, maybe you'd like to come in with comments on this particular poem, Disembodied, which Sudeep has just read.
Muted.
I just heard the very visceral images that Sudeep created for this work. What I want to say is that, first of all, Sudeep is very innovative in this book as a whole, because he has made a hybrid work. I called it an epic, but it's really a collaged epic of small haikus, of prose poems, of meditations, of longer lyric narratives, and they all are woven together to create something that I think is the only way a poet can actually circle and imagine and call into the forest of the situation that we're in. I don't know whether that's worded well or not, but it's a very interesting work because it respects visual art, produces visual art. I loved the way you brought in the front page of the New York Times with all of the names and the blacked out page to fuse together with your elegiac and really loving poems for the ill and the dying and the dead. There's an elegiac tone to the book, but there's also a hopeful tone. The elegiac tone is not only for people lost, although certainly for them, but also for a world we are losing, and for for other species, for even kinds of weather, because you you recognize in all of these poems the shifts in the seas and the shifts in the air, and even the heat, which you've always known in Delhi, is different now and more intense and made more acute. And what I thought you did so well was to thread images throughout the book, which built upon each other and became emblematic and became a kind of portrait of a time that we could feel in our bodies. It's a very strong sensorium you've built here. You know, we can feel the oppression of the heat, but then we feel relieved by a breeze. And then, you know, you go out to the terrace and you make a photograph, and then you come inside and you worry about what is to come. And with a deep awareness throughout of the collective experience of humanity right now in this moment, for the first time in contemporary history, that we are all afflicted at once with the same precise difficulty, which is to survive a virus to which we are vulnerable. And I think this is the first pandemic book I've seen that, you know, takes this on and really accomplishes it. So I know I've gone beyond the disembodied poem, but I have so much to say about
it. That's great. Thank you. And Sudeep will read some more of his work, but before he does, may I just draw your attention to the fact that lots of people have been writing in thanking and congratulating Sudeep for the book, on the book. Indran Amritanayagam, Sudeep Kohli, Dalip Mehra, Ashok Upadhyay, Kubud Rai, Sandra Swarup, Kiran Bhatt, Kalpana Sharma, Meena Chopra, Inakshi Ganguly, Shonali Primlani, Sunita Pant Bansal, Pankaj Vasudev, etc. It just goes on and on and on. But Meena Chopra has left a specific comment, which is very sensitive, just beautiful, Sudeep. Congratulations. Can't wait to read your book, and see you soon. And Sandra Swarup says, your poem is a touchstone, Sudeep, testing the purity of truth with great sensibility. So those are audience comments, and I just wanted to feed them in at this stage. Obviously, there'll be time for questions and answers and so on later. But perhaps, Sudeep, you'd take us on to the next poem you want to read.
Yes, I mean, this was a bit of a surprise, and I like surprises, as you know, since I spring surprises on people. Thank you all, I mean, for commenting. I can see the parallel screens buzzing at the moment, you know. I mean, there's an audience from all over the place, you know, Europe and America and England and so on. Sandra Swarup, I want to just talk about her because she was my high school English teacher who I haven't met for, I don't know, 20 years.
Wow.
She's logged on. In school, I was the only student who took higher English. You know, we had to take 5 subjects. And so my principal told me that I can't take higher English for my boards because you need a teacher to approve it, to assess it. So she willingly said, okay, I'll be happy to be your guide. And so we would just meet under a tree or in what we had in our school called the Parlour. This is St. Columba School in Delhi, a good old Irish Brothers School in Delhi. And when I sat for the exam, it was this vast hall for 500 students. There were 20 invigilators and 1 student writing this paper. It was really eerie, but Sandra, lovely. Thank you very, very much. Caroline, you talked about the 2 photographs I have. Basically, the facsimiles of the New York Times front page. And, you know, you can't be but not struck by the front page, which just basically lists the people who died. This was, of course, in the early stages of the pandemic, about 1.5 years ago. And then there was another front page, which was also emblematic and symbolic. They just blanked out the whole front page and it was black. You have the pictures, but this is how it looks, yes.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
And to me, because I'm interested in architecture and the visual aspect of things, and had lived in New York for 5 years, you know, so for me, tall buildings in Manhattan, you know, so all these columns, newsprint columns, were like these epitaphs, stacked, generations being stacked over one another. I mean, if you go to a place like Egypt, the burial grounds are such that, you know, they're underground. And so if you're standing on top, I think there are at least, I don't know how many generations of kings and queens and normal people were buried there. So that was what it was. And then, of course, the poem is simply obituary. And the epigraph is from the newspaper headline. And I quote, "They were not simply names on a list, they were us. Death knell peals, numbers multiply, virus ravages us one by one. Newspaper columns loom, unsteady ghostly apparitions on broadsheets. Name, age, date of death, tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark, newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Our lives, micro point-sized fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list. Black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster. Another sick, another dying, another dead. Yes, they were us." The next one is similar in tone. It's called Hope, Light Leaks. And it was very important for me to concentrate on hope, because we can moan and groan about the tragedy. I mean, everybody's lives are, difficult in one way or the other. But if you do not have hope, there's no way to carry on, which is why I end the book with one of my favorite poets, the Polish poet, Caroline, you may know him, Milosz Czesław Milosz. And I will read that little epigraph, which is actually bookends the book at the end. And it says, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow." So it's the swallow, with the swallow, and the swallow of new science, vaccination, protecting the earth, protecting other human beings, and so on. Hope, light leaks. And it opens with an epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr. And I quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge. A cleaving schism, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Light's plane waxes, wanes, viral load expands, contracts. Photons spill, conduction sparks. Light slow removes cataract's veil. In this blackness, lives matter. And it's, we sigh because we know the context. Black Lives Matter and so on. Racism is on an all-time high. But it's really about breathing or not breathing. It's about hope again. It's about getting our systems back in order. It's about getting the earth to breathe again. And it's about all of us to breathe again. Too long we have been living in silos. And the borders ideally should be vanished, but of course that's asking for too much, perhaps. Love in the time of Corona. Again, I talk about what was going on in the early days of the pandemic. Of course, it references the obvious novel, Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. I read the poem, just enjoy it, soak it in. It opens with two epigraphs, and we'll talk about epigraphs because actually Mala had a question on epigraphs. I use a lot of epigraphs throughout the book and in general, and I'll tell you why much later when we talk about this. Love in the time of cholera. I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera. The second epigraph, in the dark times, there will also be singing. Sorry, in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Brecht, of course. Faint indigo tints in the grays of your hair evoked memory. Faint indigo tints in the grays of your hair evoke memory. Krishna's love for Radha, its perennial longevity, its sustained mythology, its blue-bathed lore. Such are life's enduring parallels. 14 years, yet my heart flutters infatuated like first love. My hands fidgety, palms sweaty, pulse too fast to pick. I'm not allowed to touch your face. Cyber flurry emoji love cannot assuage fears or corona's comatose cries. I don't believe in God. In thousands, migrant workers march home, hungry footsteps on empty highways accentuate irony. Social distancing of privilege only powerful can afford. Cretins spray bleach on unprotected poor, clap, bang plates, ring bells, blow conches, light fires to get rid the voodoo. Koruna's karma infected. Meetings in sanitized quarantine, self-isolation impose, uncontained virus viral. When shall we sing our dreams' epiphanies? Cities' weather fluctuates promiscuously, mapping temperatures by polar graph. Tropics air conditioner chill, winter's unseasonal hailstorm, skies pink blue spring. Blue gray will mold into salt and pepper, ash gray to silver white, then to aged white. My lungs heave, slow grating metallic crackles struggle to escape the filigreed windpipes. I persist in my prayers. I'm afraid of him. Hope, heed, heal. Our song in present tense.
There we are. Yes. Thank you, Sudeep, for reading those three poems to us. Very moving. And again, there are lots of comments from different people. I'm just going to read one from Sunita Pant Bansal, who says, Sudeep, you are speaking for all of us. I lost a young cousin last month and my father-in-law a week ago. Listening to you is so cathartic. Thanks for putting our emotional upheavals into words. And I think that really speaks for all of us, doesn't it? But I wonder if either Malashri or Caroline have anything they wish to add to the discussion of these three poems, and then I'll go on to pick up some other contributions from our audience so that we can weave them into the discussion.
Yeah, if I could come in at this point, it's completely appropriate and expected that a book like this one, Anthropocene, and Sudeep's writing should have attracted an audience from around the world for this book launch. Because, as the person just said, it's a book that speaks to each of us wherever we are, in whatever situation we are. So I want to ask Sudeep about this amazing ability to blend the local and the global. You speak about Radha and Krishna in one of the poems that you read. There's several of your poems in which the neem tree outside your study becomes a very important metaphor for organic growth, but also decay and rebirth. And you're also a person with a background in science. So you make that crossover from science to the arts. You also have inter-genre minglings because you look at music, dance, poetry, art. So I'm interested in this whole range that you're able to traverse and yet hold on very firmly to that craft of writing which turns experience into poetry.
Yes, thank you. My gosh, that's so many good things all of you are saying. It's just almost embarrassing, but thank you very, very much. I'm just glad that these poems could speak to you all. As I'm reading it, at some level, I also feel so overwhelmed because there's so much darkness. But then, if you only think of darkness, we'll never move on. So it's important to celebrate. Yes. Talking about the different aspects in my poetry, the thing is, again, it's the way I grew up. When you, for instance, in India, if you want to be a classical Indian musician, when you go to a school, a music school, then you have to learn how to read poetry, you have to learn literature, you have to learn history, you have to learn how to dance, theater, and then you can specialize in whatever you're doing. I think it's so important because, actually the grammar across these fields are exactly the same. People often ask me that, poetry, and these are, of course, amateur poets and young poets, and so much bad poetry has come, it's happened because you can write a sentence, I'm using the word sentence and not line, you can write a sentence, split it up into 5 parts, arrange it in a column and print it out with a good font on a laser printer, and it actually kind of looks pretty legit. But that's not how it works because, there's caesuras, there's metrical units, there's traditions that go behind poetry, musicality. So the fact that all that was present, I love listening to music. It could be jazz one night or Indian classical music another night. I was very, very lucky that I grew up in a very, very broad-minded household where I would go to school and start the school with the Lord's Prayer, Our Father in Heaven, and then walk back, talking in Hindi and speaking Bangla at home. So it was just a privilege. I can't take any of this accolades myself. It's been passed down to me and I'm just trying to make the best use of it. But the thing is, science and art are just the yin yang of our lives. I always urge people to read our only Nobel laureate from India, Rabindranath Tagore, his letters to Albert Einstein. They met. It's very interesting. They met, I think, and they were walking. They were very good friends with Robert Frost as well, I think. So they were walking in the woods, and the book was eventually published as letters between Einstein and Tagore. And Einstein didn't talk about science or physics, and Tagore didn't talk about poetry or music. The whole book is an expression of philosophy, of life, of ideas. So that's where it all comes from, So if I choose to specialize in poetry, the artifacts and the grammar and the syntax of all the other art forms and disciplines are very much part of it. Otherwise, it'll be in isolation. I don't want my poets. My ideal reader is an intelligent reader or any reader who reads it. It's not an English literature student or another poet. If a bank manager reads it and finds something good, or if anybody who can find sense in it, which is why as a young poet, I remember many of my poems were very complicated, very dense. You try and show off so much. And basically, my elders told me, you don't need any of it. If the ideas are complex, the language could be very subtle and supple and swift and textured and cadence, and that's all you need. And so all the other arts and my interest in the other things actually helped me to write better poetry. And not just that, translation is another side of my life. So because I enjoy translation from Hindi, Bangla, and Urdu, that I think makes me a better poet in the English language. And of course, I've also translated from languages I don't know. For instance, going back to Jerusalem, where Carolyn and I were both there as part of the Jerusalem International Festival. The festival was one of the best organized festivals in the world, I think. And so during the day, when poets are busy, they also had events and activities for the accompanying spouses. So you could go for a trip to see the old city and so on. But during the day, they were having a workshop. And I remember it was a very unique poet, Abraham Ben-Itzhak, who's written only 16 poems in his life, and he was being translated. And the workshop was being led by Stanley Moss and Daniel Weisbord. So a friend of mine, another poet from Macedonia, and he and I just said, well, let's just sit and we never translated in our lives. So there were 5 linguists, 5 Hebrew speakers, a couple of poets, and we were given all the background and they were at it. But the interesting things were we came as unseasoned translators and were translating because we had the literals in front of us and they were reading it out in Hebrew. But the versions they were producing were very academic, very staccato. And he and I, Zoran Anchevsky, who also was the director of the Stuga Poetry Festival, he and I just took that workshop. And we were just having so much fun producing. And eventually our translations were published. So yes, all these things come in, the fact that one is hopefully in an osmotic sense trained in the other arts and the other ideas. Yeah, but really as an amateur.
Talking about training, one of the comments that's come in is from Madhulika Banerjee, and she says, both Obituary and Hope are beautiful poems. For staid social scientists, this is the perfect complement to the theories of climate change. I know I will be reading from your book in my class. She means the class she's teaching, of course. I know I'll be reading from your book in my class. And I hope many teachers will use your poems in their classes because they reach us at a different level than just the intellectual. But Carolyn, you were going to perhaps share some things in relation to these 3 poems or anything else. Please do.
I love how interconnected poets are all over the world. I remember Zoran from Struga and our wonderful time in Jerusalem. And you might want to, I'm really happy you brought up Tagore because several years ago, our mutual friend Joy Harjo, current US Poet Laureate, and we were able to visit Shantiniketan to visit his birthplace, his house where he lived, and actually to touch the manuscripts, which I thought was amazing because usually such things are behind glass, but it was really a lovely experience. I want to speak to the first poem you read that addressed, in a sense, the way that we are mirrored back the deaths of the pandemic is in bureaucratic and repertorial language, journalistic language, those columns of newsprint, those names listed that become so dense the screen becomes black. Another Polish poet, Wisława Szymborska, wrote, "History counts its skeletons in round numbers." And I think this, so that it doesn't account for the pathos and complexity and difficulty and pain of individual death. And I think that's what's happened when so many people die in such a short period of time. It's really essential to acknowledge their individual lives and humanity and to honor them individually. And of course, it becomes a very intense, massive collective experience, but it is also deep personal loss. And I think that's what your poem was addressing in that. And I was really happy that you took that on because it's the poet's work to challenge other language games, other other language narratives, the journalistic, the bureaucratic, even the scientific, and to deepen them and to focus our attention more spiritually and passionately on the experience of human subjectivity. And I think you do that a great deal in this book.
Thank you, Caroline. I mean, for me, we write regardless of whatever happens. And, people talk about isolation and loneliness, but I've always lived in self-isolation. I mean, I live in a bubble, which is my study, and that's where I write, regardless of the wonderful world outside. And it's only, when we go to festivals or in the evening readings that we are social, and we are perhaps a bit too chatty because we have not spoken for the entire day. But yes, I think it is very important to sort of cross-link the arts and the other thing, because very often I find people say poetry, my gosh, it's difficult. It's only meant for, it's not. The best poems speak really to the people. And as it's the testament to the fact that Professor Madhulika Banerjee, who's one of India's best political scientists and is a professor, she wants to teach this in a political science class. Yesterday, completely by chance, I get a message on Facebook from a gentleman I don't know, but he's part of the Norwegian climate change movement and the Writers' Union there. And he found out about this, and he's just run an extract from the book. And he said, normally on our website, we annotate and footnote things, but your essay is so beautiful that we don't have to do anything. It just says everything. You've got the facts in there, and it's lyrical. So yes, I hope there's more dialogue and the divisions are, erased. Yes, and Caroline, you are the queen of the poetry of witness, your book. Yes. You must get hold of this book. Of course, everybody must have read it. It's an iconic text, man.
Good. Mala, any further comments from you before we go to the audience and get audience questions in?
Yes, a few observations and queries. I want to focus on this idea of hope that you mentioned, Sudeep. And the book ends on a note of seeking consolation through prayer, through meditation, through the expression of caring and sympathy for the world that is suffering, and we are part of that process. So along with the poems, you also have these epigraphs, and we have talked a little about it, but I'm curious, what makes you choose these particular authors or lines as epigraphs to the poem? Because yes, it does create a context, as in the poem Love in the Time of Corona. But in the other poems also, the aura of that other writer is there, but it doesn't encompass or squeeze your poetry in any way. It in fact liberates you from that bind with that epigraphic moment, if I may say so. So I'm curious about that. And when it comes to meditation and prayer, there is an intertextuality with your earlier poems, such as the prayer flags, which has been so often anthologized. And it talks about the Buddhist practice of reaching up to the heavens, looking for benediction at times when we don't understand the nature of human suffering. So that's my comment and my query. How does the poetry, the epigraph, the idea of consolation and hope hold together? And is that the final message of this book?
So I'll start from the back. There is no final message. I like everything to be open-ended. Anybody who comes to the book can take away what he or she likes and what she wants to take. I also want them to read the book slowly, because poetry needs to be read slowly. You don't have to finish the book in one go. You can read one page, keep it. That's why more often than not, on the bedside table, it's a book of poems which is there. Novels get sorted back onto your library shelves because you've done with it, unless you're writing a piece, paper or writing a review, you'll mark it up. But poetry stays close by. Epigraphs to me is something that I've now noticed that it's a kind of an obsessive habit. It's not something that I want to do. I do it consciously. But what happens is, as I'm listening to poetry, I read a lot of other people's poetry. It's just my best sort of tonic or meditation is reading other people's poetry while there's music going on in the back. And my little earthen pot with the frogs, with the water spouting. So there's a very zen sound in my house with the water gurgling at the back. But the epigraphs are basically signposts or homages to work / people / artifacts I have particularly enjoyed. So I note them down. I have a diary where I just keep writing these things down, as I do with my own inspirational thoughts anyway. That's where much of the poetry comes from, these notes which I have. Also, sometimes the epigraphs don't act as homages, but as a counterpoint, so that, the other side is sort of stated, and then I explore the other element. It's almost like the visual quality of the poetry is also very important to me. I'm just anal about typeface, font, and position on the page because it's so critical for poetry. And to me, the white space on a page is just as important as the inked part of the book. If you don't have the white space to breathe, I don't think the words will breathe. I don't think the words will sort of, bloom in a way that it otherwise does in a crowded space. So epigraphs are, it's just a fascination because I think, it kind of weaves the entire book into a kind of a narrative. It's like the red and white blood corpuscles, which are flitting around, but which have their own very distinct DNA, but they tend to unite our entire body and the circulatory system. And they're interesting. I mean, sometimes I look at it as, why didn't I write this line? So what's the next best thing to do? Put it in the poem and give credit to where it's due, because I can't plagiarize, sadly, because someone's done it better. So yeah, that's really, it's really, my own way of talking to various people, both dead and alive, to keep the continuum going. And across the arts, so you'll have a filmmaker. The title of my introduction is from Akira Kurosawa, for instance. There are scientists who I've quoted. There are poets, of course, who I quote. There are musicians. Sometimes you'll have notations in Farsi. The Ghalib piece I write, the epigraph is in a different script altogether. So yes, it's a uniquely crazy obsession, but yes, since you studied it so well, yes, it's a paper for you to do, perhaps.
Sudeep, there's a question from Anju Makhija asking, what is the time frame that your book was written in? So this is an almost factual question, but maybe it gives rise to some reflections as well.
Thank you, Anju, for asking that. Anju is a colleague and a poet. She lives in Bombay, fine poet. Anju, I wrote this book largely over the last 1.5, 2 years, during the lockdown. So 80% of the book is actually very, very fresh. It's very unusual for me to kind of put things in print so quickly. I usually wait for a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years. And I usually have 80-90% of the book published in various magazines and journals before I even send it out to a publisher. But it was just one of those things that was because there was nothing else to do. I was just writing and reading, and the only way to get away from grief was to write. So yes, I wrote it in 1.5 years, maybe 14 months, most of it, 80% of it. And then there were some other poems which I thought fitted the theme well, and I resurrected them and put them in the book. So it's very, very current. And since the book was sent to the printers, I've written another maybe 20 more, which I feel, gosh, I wish it was time to put it in the book because, it's bustling. It's bustling. It's
a follow-up volume, perhaps, a follow-up volume.
And I think, we can only be grateful that things are coming because there are long moments of hiatus, where nothing happens, Yeah. So we keep it. Yes. Thank you, Anju.
Another question is from Bhai Baldeep Singh, and he asks, are you able, Sudeep, to, in your poems, differentiate between personal, familial grief and the grief at large, grief in the world, other people's grief? Maybe you have some reflections on that.
Yeah, definitely, Bhai. Yeah, so, even if I'm writing a poem, say, taking off from a very, very personal episode, the trick ultimately for the poem to work is to universalize it, ultimately. But not to the point that the poem becomes anodyne. So the specificity of the personal has to be there. So how Mala picked up the neem tree, which is so specific to my view every day, becomes a tree of the world. It's also the filter. As you know, neem is supposed to be the best plant for filtering the air. So nobody in India cuts a neem tree off, and I have a neem tree in front of my house. So it's supposed to be a natural filter. Of course, the virus is too strong. But yes, the personal and the public very, very much are at play all the time. Sometimes I take a public act and make it personal. That's the privilege of writers. We can twist things around. But I will always say that I stick to the facts, even if I'm being fantastical or imaginative or going off on, a sort of whimsical trip. There won't be an error of fact in my work because I always cross-check, like the famous New Yorkers, fact check. For instance, when I write about classical music, and there's a whole sequence of poems on classical music, I always go back to the singer and ask, were these notations correct? Or the sort of sur and the tal, was it right? Because I don't know enough. You tell me, and and once they tell me, then I can recalibrate it. But yes, tonality, cadence, very important. Public, private, very important.
One thing we've not talked about, Sudeep, is the influence of classical writers. And Christopher Truman says your poem Obituary is superbly Horatian. And he refers to the tactile language as being the reason why he's thinking of that. Would you care to comment on the influence of classical writers on you? And remember, you have just 1 minute to do so before we come to your last poem to read at the end of the program.
So Christopher, thank you. I mean, I know Christopher Truman is an English poet. I think he lives in London. Yeah, he's a classicist himself. Yes, very, very much so. And again, the patina and the expanse is vast. So I studied the classics in college, Plato and Sophocles, and we had to study the Bible in our English literature course. With the Book of Job, we studied because so much of the referencing in literature is from the Christian theology. At the same time, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, the Vedas, so yes, very, very important. I think, it's a basic touchstone and grammar. Without the classics, you can't really, you can't function. You can, if you're super bright, you can run a sprint, but I prefer to be a Kenyan long distance runner without shoes. I like the long haul because for me, poetry is living, poetry is the breath. And to live life, you need a lot of things in place. So yes, very much.
A good note, Sudeep, to move to reading your poem, your concluding poem, That Is.
Yes, and before I do that, thank you everybody for your generous comments. Thank you, and I will personally thank everybody later. But this is a poem called That Is, and it's I.E. And it's dedicated to my son, Arya, and it's his birthday today, so happy birthday, Arya. That is. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves.
Thank you, Sudeep. And thank you to all the participants who've sent in their congratulations to you, Sudeep, all the questions, all the beautiful comments. There isn't time to read all of them, but thank you, everybody who's commented on the poems, on the reading, and on the program. Particular thanks, obviously, to Professor Malashri Lal for kindly joining us and giving us her comments. Particular thanks also, very special thanks to Caroline for joining us in the middle of a very busy life, a very eminent life, and therefore obviously in demand all the time. Thank you very much for your very generous comments as well during the program. and launching the book.
If I may add, thank you to Prabhu, the publisher, for being brave to pick up a book like this, which is very dicey, and for producing it with such care, and it's beautiful to hold. So Caroline, when you see the actual copy, you'll see what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you. Very kind of you, Sudeep. It's the job of a publisher to take risks, so I was happy to take a risk, but your poems are so beautiful that I'm sure it's no risk at all. Thank you, everybody, and great to be with you. Thank you very much for the program. Thoroughly enjoyable. Goodbye, stay safe, and stay well.
Good night.